And welcome everyone. Welcome to this latest edition of Talking Bat. And this time, I think for the second or the third time ever, we are going beyond the continent of Europe and we're going into Africa. And we're actually going Southern Africa even, with Professor Peter Taylor. How are you doing, Peter?
Very fine, thanks, Neil. And yourself?
I'm doing very well, thank you. We've had a bit of a bumpy road getting to this point between different things. So just to let us know, technology issues and stuff like that meant they could have had this out a little bit sooner, but here we are at long last, and this is the first time I've actually met you face-to-face, Peter. So I'm really looking forward to this. When you woke up this morning, Peter, did you think, oh darn, why did I ever agree to do this? Or were you thinking, yeah, this might be all right? What was your thoughts?
I thought it could be fun. I'm not stressed at all. I expected it to be chilled. Yeah.
Okay, it's definitely good.
I was just sorry for the false start. As you know, a week ago, I had no voice, and even now my voice is a bit croaky. So I was just a little bit nervous that my voice might go on me, but it seems to be fine.
Yeah, it's sounding good at this end anyway. And we're talking just before the start about my Scottish accent and your accent, and just double checking that we can understand each other. Okay, so if I say any words, Peter, that you're not sure of, because I'm told I'm quite a fast talker with a Scottish accent, just ask me to repeat myself. It's not a problem. Okay. So everybody,
and me too, also talk too fast. So I'm sure you'll tell me.
Absolutely. So first thing I was going to ask you, Peter, this picture down here in the bottom right-hand side, I think I got this off the internet somewhere. Where was that taken? Can you recall? Do you remember?
Yeah, I do. That was actually taken in the Drakensberg Mountains of South Africa, a good more than 10 years ago, before I actually realized I would actually be working very close to the same location. So that was at Monkskuil in the Drakensberg.
Wow.
And yeah, in a way, I've come a circle and now I'm staying at a university very close to that location. But at the time I was staying at Durban at the Natural Science Museum, and I'm about to move to the University of Venda. So it just happened to be taken in the mountains.
Wow. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about the National Science Museum and the University of Venda, I'm sure. But before we do that, I just want to give people a very quick overview of who you are. And listen, folks, a lot of you are in Europe or the Americas or Asia that might be watching this. So you may not necessarily be from a part of the world where you would necessarily know who Peter was. But I can totally assure you that if you had anything to do with not just South African bats, but probably just mammals generally in Southern Africa, I'm pretty certain you would have either heard of Peter or you would know Peter and some of the stuff that he's been up to. But here is just a very brief overview. His research focuses on bats and other mammals in natural and agricultural landscapes, predominantly Southern African species. You did your PhD at the University of Natal in Durban, Peter, on yellow mongoose. You were then the curator of mammals at Durban Natural Science Museum for quite a long period of time there, actually. That's what, 21 years, if my arithmetic is correct. You're the co-founder of a bat conservation organization called Bats KZN, associate professor for a couple of years, then going on to be a professor as of 2012, and the South African Research Chair in Biodiversity, Value and Change in Vemb Biosphere Reserve at the University of Venda, and you are now currently professor at the University of the Free State. I'm not going to say how to pronounce that campus. I'll leave you to do that. But does that pretty much summarize yourself, Peter? Is there anything that you'd like to pull out of that, just to kind of give us a bit more depth?
Yeah, the pronunciation of that campus is not easy. It's got a click and it's a quack quack. So I wouldn't have expected you to have managed that.
Okay.
So yeah, that looks pretty complete. Thanks, Neil. I don't know if you want. I don't have any points at the moment. I think you've covered all my bases. Thanks. Yeah.
Well,
as you say, a lot of my research has been on African mountains. In the beginning, it was just more or less fortuitous because I did work there, but now it's become more and more focused. So very much mountain environments and Afro-montane mammals is the focus.
Okay, so by Afro-montane, which is maybe an expression that a lot of people may not have heard outside of Africa, you basically mean mammals that occur in African mountainous habitat. Yes.
Yeah. That's pretty much all it really means. African mountain. Afro-montane. There was the term was coined by a botanist on a book on the vegetation of Africa, and he described very poetically almost this Afro-montane archipelago. So all these mountain sky islands of habitats that are almost like an archipelago, these sort of isolated habitats occurring right across Africa. So that I like that term, Afro-montane archipelago, because it helps explain why we have such incredible diversity and speciation in these montane habitats, because they're so isolated by lower lying elevations. They sort of evolutionary cradle, if you like, of diversity of mammals and other plants and animals.
Okay. So does that tend, and excuse me, I mean, I've been to Africa a few times, but never doing research, pretty much only as a kind of a traveler. And the furthest south I've been is Namibia. I was very fortunate. I've spent almost 3 weeks in Namibia a few years ago. But I kind of noticed, once you start getting a little bit higher up, you tend to get away from a lot of the land-based mammals that maybe tourists are accustomed to seeing. Is that a fair? Is that a fair reflection? I mean, or not necessarily. I suppose it depends how high up you go. Is it?
Definitely. I mean, when we think of Africa's great wildlife, we're thinking of the plains and the Serengeti. That's the image we have of African the charismatic wildlife. So up where I live, we do have large mammals such as eland, which are really culturally important, occurring right high up in the mountains. And where I worked in the mountains in East Africa, Mount Elgin, we saw buffalo right up at 4,000 meters. So there are exceptions to that, but it's definitely, like you say, the Great Plains where the large mammals are. And the mountains very often harbor small mammals and small creatures and plants that aren't found anywhere else in the world, that are endemic, but smaller sized is probably correct to say.
So let's go back to yourself as a teenager. Were you always going to take the route down natural history? Are you always destined to be on the kind of journey that you're on? Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Definitely, I was always going to be a zoologist, and I was very, very inspired as a school child by Gerald Durrell's books and books like that described wild places and mammals in detail. So I always wanted to study mammals, even though as a child, I think I was more into the arts and creative things in a way than hard science. But my love of nature and zoology, I think there was never any doubt from the time I was probably 12 years old that I was going to do zoology. And so it just followed very naturally. I I think I was saying before we were cut off, I was so inspired by Gerald Durrell that I wrote to the Jersey Wildlife Preservation Trust for a job when I was 14. And they told me, no, they're sorry they didn't have any openings for me at the time.
Oh, I've actually been to Jersey, and I've been inside the site there. It's a pretty amazing place. Yeah. But wow, so you were always going to take that route, which is really interesting. Yeah. So here we are. Here's a map of Southern Africa, folks, and you can see Johannesburg up here, and where Peter is currently based is this area here called, this location here called the University of the Free State. I won't do the pronunciation, but we mentioned previously that you had quite a long spell in the Natural History Science Museum in Durban. I know it's called something slightly different, but you're quite, what's it, 20 plus years there? How did you, tell us about your experiences there.
Yeah, it was more than 20 years. So there was no curator of mammals before I started the Durban Natural Science Museum. So it was a new position, and I just finishing my PhD on mongooses. So it was kind of very much a natural thing for me. The collection was very new. So I kind of threw myself into that job. And pretty soon we were collecting, all sorts of mammals, like my hero, Gerald Durrell, but small mammals. So mammals, rodents and bats. So it was about that time that I got really excited about bats. I didn't know much about bats at all. I was interested in mongooses and rodents. I knew very little about bats, but very early in my career, there was a documentary from a film company that needed somebody to talk about bats, and there was no one else in the country. That was back in about 1994. So I'd only been working at the museum a couple of years. So we decided, based on what we were hearing about was the great success of bat clubs in the UK. There was a manual published around the early 90s, and we thought the museum would be a great platform to launch a bat club. So we basically copied the British model in a way, decided we're going to do a bat group, and everybody thought we were a bit mad. But that basically was very much an early part of my museum career. So a lot of the time I'm collecting mammals like bats, and people think that there's a bit of a contradiction, that why would I, collecting specimens is usually entails being destructive. You have to unfortunately, you need to sacrifice specimens. So a lot of the knowledge we have, though, for the books that I've written come from those collections. So it's, I'm just trying to throw in a bit of education there. The museums are often seen as not being pro-conservation and just, killing animals, but it's not true. A lot of museum collections are very valuable. And so they work to support conservation quite strongly.
Yeah, and back then, and even further back than that, we didn't have the technology and the techniques and the approaches that we would maybe use today to identify animals. So
that is so true.
So when you go back then, it's difficult, I would imagine now, for I suppose youngsters that are involved in scientific study to perhaps appreciate that, back in the 1980s and then 1970s, and then long before that, there was no internet, there was no guides on identifying bats on their acoustics, etc. DNA. Who would have been using DNA to identify animals 30, 40 years ago? So
I think I completely agree with you. Yeah. I mean, we didn't have any of those sorts of techniques like DNA and bat detectors. We hadn't got any bat detectors. So now there's, we got far more opportunities for research and investigation into bats. So I completely agree with you. But those collections formed a wonderful deposit and reference, of life on Earth. And of course, the Natural History Museum in London, all the great museums of the world, even now you can get DNA from those old collections. You can do so much more with those old collections, so that I think they form important foundation.
Yeah. No, it's it's really, really interesting to get that perspective, and you're not the first person that's been on one of these sessions that's talked about something similar.
Good.
Going back, what things were like going back quite a few decades. So it's really good to get that perspective. Now, whilst you were just moving on to the next slide now. You've got here, you went on after Durban to go to the University of Venda, and here you describe as continuing with your taxonomic research in small mammals, describing 17 new species. I suppose once you get to number 17, you're probably thinking, okay, here's another one. But I'm trying to put your mind back to the very first time that you maybe appreciated that you were going to get involved in describing a new species. I don't even know what it was a new species of, or hopefully you do. How did that feel? I mean, was that quite exciting, or was it quite, just talk us through what you felt about that? Because most people don't get the opportunity to describe one new species. Okay, so you possibly thought back then, well, this is it. This is probably the only time this is ever going to happen, perhaps.
Yeah. It's also a historical thing as well, in that we are in a new age of discovery. So the pace of which we accelerate, the pace at which we're describing new species is accelerating. So, 25 sort of years ago, it seemed like a really big deal to describe a new species of mammal. But a lot of it's, I think what people don't realize, it's very, very time consuming to write a taxonomic paper and revise a group. Basically, you've had to consult museum collections around the world. You've got to do your homework. You can't just come up with a species and say, that's great, I'll call that so-and-so's bat. You've got to do the groundwork to check that it hasn't been described before. And, we have what we call synonyms that have been described by early explorers. So in most cases, it's nothing really new. Someone's already described it. So sometimes the names are already available, but it's always cool when you can describe a species after somebody that there isn't any available name. So actually, one of my rodents I described, I called it Willen's rat, basically Willen's flay rat, after a very good friend and mentor of mine who studied rodents. So I'm not even talking bats, but it was a pleasure to describe Willen's rodent. And one of the bats I described, I called Smithers horseshoe bat. And Ray Smithers was very, very famous pioneer researcher in Southern Africa who wrote the mammals of the Southern African sub-region in 1983. Before that, he wrote mammals of Rhodesia and Zimbabwe and, Botswana. So that was also good, gave me immense pleasure to describe Smithers horseshoe bat after Ray Smithers, who was somebody I admired immensely. So, a lot of the work is very laborious and it doesn't give you goosebumps, but it's very rewarding when sometimes 3, 4, 5 years it takes from the time you've discovered and this is new to the time you see it appearing in a publication. So often it's a delayed gratification, but it's still incredibly rewarding. And at the moment, we've got a couple of species that we are about to announce and describe, one of which is endemic to these high mountains, and we're very excited about this new horseshoe bat. But you probably have to watch the space for about 2 years before you see anything published.
Wow, amazing stuff. But the bulk of your time, I think, from what I can gather, having done a little bit of research on you and then speaking to you before we started today, the bulk of your time, I think I'm right in saying you're involved in studying bat species and I think bird species and their impact as a control of insect pests, for example, for certain fruit and farm-related activities. Do you want to talk a little bit about those things? So I think on the one hand, we've got the nuts, and the other hand, I think we've got the apples. So I think the nuts was all to do with Venda, and the apples is all to do with Free State. Have I got that the right way around?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. So the nut research basically is about 10 years, again, very slow to take off, but partnerships, especially working with colleagues in Germany, University of Göttingen, and universities like that. I've been incredibly fortunate to get access to funding and collaborators who've been able to do these giant experiments. So ever since I started the BAT group, one of our absolute dreams was to show farmers the value and importance that bats provide in terms of controlling crop pests. And we always said that there's no research done on this, but if we want to convince the public about the importance of conservation and positive messages, not negative messages, we've got to provide actual evidence of that. So we did these giant experiments by blocking and basically excluding, putting nets over these nut orchards, these macadamia nut orchards, to keep birds out during the day and bats out at night, and birds and bats as well in different combinations. So we were able to, from the economic data farmers gave us, and knowing what the damage was caused by insects, especially stink bugs, to the nuts and the loss of quality, we could put numbers and show that if you didn't have bats and birds in those orchards, you as a farmer would have to be spraying more poisons. It would costing you $5,000 a hectare a year. That was the avoided cost. That was what it would cost you more if you didn't have bats and birds. And then we began to realize that natural habitats had provided more of a service. In those natural habitats, the damage that we lost when we kept bats and birds up was greater because natural habitats harbored bats and birds. So for me, that was one of the milestones of my research, that it was a dream come true, that I always wanted to be able to give realistic figures to farmers. And so that's inspired this work on apples, which is very recent research in the last 2 or 3 years, with one of our PhD students. So yeah, the macadamia work was actually mostly 2 PhD students of mine, Sina Vaya and Valerie Linden, who undertook the work. They were from Germany and they've now settled in South Africa, and our collaborators are from Germany. So this was part of a really exciting experiment, and we're trying to just do similar things. So quite a bit of this research, and I'm sure you've heard from some of you other people you've interviewed, this kind of research is starting to take off in other parts of the world as well. And we're beginning to see just how vital bats are. And my mentor, Merlin Tuttle, told us that many years ago when he visited us in South Africa at the beginning of our bat group, he told us we don't actually have any idea how important bats really are, and that whatever we figure as to how the importance is probably an order of magnitude less than the actual benefit they provide. So he is actually right. You know, when we do the sums, we're finding that bats kind of blow us away, and that we can't afford not to have them in our farms. And ironically, yet we often farming practices provide, you know, they don't involve appropriate use of pesticides. They clear land unjudiciously, and there's reasons why, you know, they have negative effects on, in fact, their own livelihoods, because, you know, they then have to spray more poisons to try and keep the insects at a manageable level. So in the longer term, it just doesn't help, you know, and then you poison the natural enemies like bats and the natural insects by adding more poison. So it's really hard to convince farmers that in the short term, you should have acceptable loss and for the greater good of in the longer term to have more sustainable sort of farming practices. So it's hard to convince farmers when their profit, you know, is from one year to the next.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But taking the example of being able to demonstrate the monetary saving and costs, you know, the 5,000 per hectare, I think that you quoted, that's money that's coming off their bottom line. If they're spending 5,000 a hectare, that's coming off of their profitability. If they're not spending it, then that's that's like selling a whole load of fruit or nuts that they didn't actually have because they haven't had the associated cost. And obviously, you know a lot more about this stuff than I do because you've done the numbers.
I think you're right, but they don't see that. That's the problem. They don't see them because they get it for free. So
and that's the thing. And obviously, in the middle of and you're still developing and doing this research relating to the apple industry. But I'm assuming that you're either hoping or you're beginning to find similar results, or are you unable to say at this stage? Is it too early?
Yeah, it's still too early to say with the apples. The main pests they have are codling moths and false codling moths, and they almost certainly are pest pests that we know bats eat from other studies done in other parts of the world. So yeah, we're pretty certain that we're going to find that important part of the diet of bats. So far, we've been collecting samples on about, to look at this sort of activity of bats, where they are in these farms, and also what they are feeding on. So we find it pretty cool that if you put lots of bat houses into these agricultural landscapes, making sure that they're not on the farms themselves where they'll get sprayed, then we find that we put little trays under the bat houses, and we put lots of them up on farms, and bats are frequently using those bat houses, even if it's just a few bats for a few days at a time. But it's given us a brilliant, actually quite a novel method of collecting the droppings that, the pellets, the fecal pellets of the bats. So the bats they occupy the bat house, they drop their pellets on these trays that we've installed. So it gives us a way of regularly collecting samples. So we're actually very excited now to use DNA methods, multiplex primers and DNA embedded barcoding, as well as more conventional methods. So we've actually got, and farmers themselves with bats living in their roofs and so on, and also by catching bats, we've actually got, by two students have got wonderful sample size. So now we just have to get into the laboratory and analyze the data. So we don't have data yet, but we've got a lot of samples.
So let me ask a couple of questions then about, first of all, these bat houses. I think I know what's going on here, but if you look at the picture, folks, you'll see that one of the bat houses is white in color. The other one is dark in color. I'm assuming, Peter, this is all to do with trying to regulate different temperature regimes within the bat boxes. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. So there'll be more solar absorbance in the black bat houses. They'll be warmer. The white ones will reflect more heat. So this was something, again, Merlin Tuttle suggested that we do it long ago. So there's a nice experimental aspect to that. Yeah, each pair of bat houses, as you see, mounted on one pole, has a black one that's facing the sort of warmer northwest and a white one that's facing the colder southern aspect. So we're getting the maximum gradient. So we have been monitoring the bat houses on the apple farms and on schools in the local area. And so we have these data, but we just haven't analyzed them yet. But we've had quite regular occupancy of these bat houses, which is exciting. Sometimes a whole maternity roost of female breeding females will use the bat house. Other times it seems to be bachelor males that are using the bat houses. So we're learning a lot from this experiment. I think we put out about 30 bat houses a year ago, and now we're starting to get occupancy. And like I say, when the bats occupy the bat house, they leave a few pellets for us, which helps us to find out what the bats are feeding on.
Okay. And I would also imagine the pellets are also going to confirm what species of bat you've got. Is that correct? Or will you have a variety of different species of bats occupying these bat houses, or does it tend to be one species?
Thanks, Neil. No, that's a great question. In this area, there's one species that dominates, and that's the Cape Serotine, but quite a diversity, I think 5 or 6 species at least that we've found in the area, and it's probably more than that. So but there are 2 main species that are occupying the bat houses and are more common, or occupying people's roofs and farms and schools and towns. So one is the Cape Serotine, and other is the Egyptian free-tailed bat, Tadaridae aegyptiaca. So there are two common species that predominate, especially in these bat houses. But it's the rarest species we're also interested in that occur in lower frequencies, but that aren't found. So there are at least 3 that aren't found anywhere else in the world than in these mountains. So as I say, 2 of them probably need to be described as distinct species because they were previously part of species that might have occurred, for example, in Kenya, and it just doesn't make sense a bat would occur in Kenya and then again in these northern Drakensberg mountains. So this long-eared bat is very rare. We're quite sure that it's probably specific, endemic to our area, and not the same as what was previously found in Kenya and South Africa.
Okay, wow. Now up here, now, okay, folks, I am not going to profess to know anything at all really about bats in Southern Africa. So I'm going to say what the species is only because I saw the label on the picture that Peter sent me. I believe this is a slit-faced bat, and is it eating what you would refer to as a stink bug? Yeah.
Stink bug.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. And a picture taken by Merlin Tuttle. And Peter, you maybe don't know this, but we actually had Merlin on Talking Bat last year.
I know.
He did an interview for us, and yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was the first time I'd ever met him, and I've heard all about him and I've seen him on the internet and stuff. But yeah, an amazing, inspirational, passionate guy, you know. But this is one of Merlin's pictures. Tell us about the species and the
tell you a bit
bugs.
about that picture if you want to. That picture is a slit-faced bat, as you saw, and it is carrying a stink bug. But that was photographed in a studio that he set up in my house in 2014. And it took him about 10,000 photographs to get that one. So, you know, a lot of patience and a lot of repetition. And we had to keep him supplied. His favorite food is Merlin's favorite food is macadamia nuts. And he also needed a steady supply of stink bugs. So that's what we did. And that's all that Merlin did. He was very focused for a couple of weeks. That's all he did with his wife, Paula. And we just provided them with the bats and the stink bugs.
And the nuts.
And the macadamia nuts.
So he's sitting there eating the nuts while the bats are trying to catch the bugs. Is that kind of?
Yeah, that's right. But he also spoke to farmers there, and he was really instrumental in getting farmers on board for this project because they were skeptical. They did not believe that bats ate stink bugs. They said stink bugs fly slowly in trees. Bats don't fly there. So the farmers were very skeptical for years and years until we had DNA evidence and photographs like this one to finally persuade them and actually then demonstrate that actually not only did bats eat stink bugs, but that if you didn't have bats in your orchards, you were going to have a lot more stink bug damage in your macadamia nuts.
Which then means you're going to have to spend even more on chemicals and human resources in order to control it. No, amazing stuff. I mean, when I saw this picture of these bat houses here, I'm going to tell a little bit of a story here from my own perspective. I'm sitting in Polmont in the central belt of Scotland, folks, and outside my window, about 4 miles that direction, I believe is the only example in Scotland of a bat box that looks like this on top of a telegraph pole, and it was a very dark one that we used. And this is kind of why I knew what was going on with this different color variation here, because what they did in North America, goodness, they've been doing this for decades, is the different colors of bat box. And the further south you were in the United States, you would go for a lighter colored box because that would reflect heat, as Peter was saying earlier. And if you're further north in North America, you would go for the darker boxes because they retained the heat because of the heat absorption. So, and I was very fortunate to be involved in the installation of one of these beside a bat roost, as I say, about 4 miles that way. It never worked, unfortunately, but that's a different story altogether. So when you sent me these pictures, Peter, I just went, yeah, wow, that's just like that big bat box we've got 4 miles that way. But yeah, it's good stuff. Good stuff. So you've got a harp trap here, got a nice Ostbat 2-bank harp trap, I think there. Do you find you spend most of your time harp trapping, or do you do a bit of mist netting? Do you get involved in, or ultrasonic luring? Do you do any of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, all of the above. Yeah, so the harp traps in some situations are really useful where there's flight paths, and in the mountains, especially where there's gorges through the mountains, the harp traps and rivers, the harp traps have been incredibly successful in some of these rare bats. But we also use different sizes of mist nets, often in combination with the harp traps. And yeah, we're using wildlife acoustics, mini song meters detectors as well, in all situations. So we've got quite a number. So yeah, we've got them all over the landscape. And that, the captures just help us reinforce, as you say, what species the bats are. So often we do need to take wing biopsies. You were talking about genetic samples, and sometimes that's necessary. But as you like you were talking about earlier, back in the 80s, you would have had to sacrifice the bat to take a specimen. But now, just from the little piece of wing, a wing biopsy, we take wing biopsies of all the bats when we release them, and that allows to help us identify the bats that we've captured. So yeah, we're using a whole combination of captures and acoustic methods now, which is very effective.
Yeah, no, it sounds good. What's happening in this big picture here at the top? You've got a group of people here, and I take it this is some of your team. Is this maybe you sitting here? Actually, I'm not even sure if that's you that's sitting down. It is you. Okay. What's going on up here? Tell us the backdrop to this picture.
Well, you can see it was during the pandemic because all the children are wearing masks and you're wearing masks. But yeah, we're trying to promote the awareness of this research that we've been doing on farms and so on. So we've partnered with 4 schools in the local area, in the Kwakwa campus area, 2 primary and 2 senior schools, where we've given presentations on bats in general, and we've used a standardized questionnaire that was published, Perez and co-workers, about perceptions of bats in Brazil, and that was published about a year ago, especially in the day of, in these days of all these pandemics and diseases, and bats often are being blamed in that context. So this questionnaire was developed to look at bat perception. We're using the standardized questionnaire. So what we're doing here is we're doing a presentation of about an hour on bats, and you can see we've put bat houses on some of the properties where the schools are. So we engaging the learners to tell them about the research we're doing and why, and to help us monitor these bat houses and see if they're occupied. So we basically are involving us here. It's a primary school, and we were just doing some games with the kids as well. So we do a presentation, but then we try and teach them about echolocation. So there was that game we used to play as kids called Marco Polo in your swimming pool, where you close your eyes and then you use sound to try and locate where someone's coming from. Okay. So we were playing that game with kids. So we would make one of them a bat, and then another one we would make them an insect, and we would use the mask to blindfold the child, and then would ask her, where's that noise coming from? And then her colleague would walk around the schoolyard, and everybody was involved in this. Yeah, she's here, he's there. So they were understanding principles about bat echolocation and how bats use echoes to hear where the prey comes from and to navigate. So it was basically just environmental education that we're doing with the kids. And what we're wanting to do is to do this questionnaire before we do any environmental classes with them and involve them in these projects. And then 6 months later, we wanted to give the same questionnaire to the same groups of children to see if there's been some change. So as you can imagine, our initial surveys showed that that children, school learners have a lot of negative ideas about bats. Some of them think that bats called COVID. Others think there's witches, the bats are associated with witchcraft, and others think that bats are evil. So there's a lot of negative stereotypes we've found and we're hoping to change them through this sort of long-term partnership. So it's not a once-off thing, but we go back, we're providing posters on bats and a Facebook page. So it's an ongoing partnership we're trying to demonstrate to these school kids and try and get to see if we can change their perceptions. And they're very quick to learn and they ask brilliant questions. So it's been fun. It's been great fun.
And of course, with kids of that age, they will then go home and even if just a small percentage of them mention to their family and their friends of family and stuff like that, what they've been doing, it begins to build momentum, doesn't it? The momentum is far greater than you potentially see here in a picture such as this. It's you could have a dozen people in that audience there that go home and present a very powerful message to other people in their community or their family group.
Yeah, we hope so, and we hope to demonstrate to them that these bats are eating pests, species like mosquitoes and crop pests that are of value. They benefit the greater community, and also just to show that there isn't anything to fear. So from the bats, and their minds are much younger than adults. So we do hope that they're more impressionable in a positive way.
Yeah.
And it will affect the broader community, because as you know, we fight these stereotypes about these myths about bats all the time.
Yeah.
So I think the best way to counter that is with a positive message about, look what bats are doing for you. Yeah. And that's another thing that Merlin taught us, rather than trying to just harp on the negative and the whole time being defensive. Actually, there's so much positive information about bats that does the job for you without trying to bring up all the negative perceptions that the public has.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And what we found in the UK, and I'm fortunate to be old enough, I suppose, to remember 30 years ago in the UK, which is almost the time when I got involved, my interest in bats began. And I remember 30 odd years ago, and this is very anecdotal, but if I said to any of my family or people that I worked with that I was involved in a bat group and I was interested in bats, I could guarantee that 80% of the time, the reaction I got from that individual was a negative reaction of some shape or form. And I now look at that today, if I go into like a family event and somebody asks me what I do and I tell them what I do, I would actually say that the whole thing is totally flipped. It's in fact, it's even higher. I very rarely hear anybody now say anything negative about bats in that environment. In fact, I'm usually told in that environment now, either they've got bats in the garden, or they remind me that bats are protected and this kind of stuff. And that was, and I've been able just personally just to see what the difference in a lot of the public's perception in the British Isles has been over the last 30 years. And of course, a lot of that, if not all of that, is down to the workings of the Bat Conservation Trust and the kind of stuff that gets shown on television by David Attenborough and people like this. It just all helps present a positive message. So I'm imagining in a different way, this is the kind of journey that you're on as well. But with different challenges, of course. Yeah,
exactly. No, that's really encouraging. And like you said, the Bat Conservation Trust, it was really an inspiration for us, because they're doing such fantastic work. And that's what we try to do, starting the bat group in Durban. And so, yeah, we probably were at an earlier stage, because that was my impression in the 90s, was a lot of negativity. But that bat group has been faithfully, just particularly amongst the public of Durban and the province around, and in South Africa, they just slowly, they have workshops for pest controllers to show them how to manage bats in roofs properly. And we've written books on bats in roofs and done a lot of press coverage and media outlet and talks to schools, many. So I wrote a paper back in 2000, I think, just about about the first 3 or 4 years of that bat group, and how many outputs we are able to achieve through school talks, rehabilitation of bats, involving the public in bats that were grounded. So there were a lot of positive aspects, and it would be nice to revisit that again and see what effects that group has had. Also, it's also started in 1994, so it's also been going for quite a long time. And it would be really nice to see, for example, with the public of Durban, where we started that group, I think there have been positive changes, but it would be nice to quantify that. As you say, the public generally now, they tell you bats are protected, whereas we saw horror stories where people would, pour boiling water over bats in their roof, or do whatever they could to exterminate bats from their roofs, which is not the case anymore. So yeah, that is promising, and it's a big job across Africa, as a whole. There's just not that much conservation effort, particularly on bats, and public outreach. There is a Bat Conservation Africa group, and they're doing an excellent job, but it's much more of a job to reach, particularly, some of the more remote areas, where there's still many of these false ideas about bats.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. It's amazing stuff, and let's hope for the continued positive momentum. You mentioned books and papers a few sentences ago there, Peter, but I did a quick trawl of the internet to see if I could find books that you've either written, either as the lead author or co-author. And I think it all started with this book down here at the bottom, The Guide to Bats of Southern Africa. Around about 2001, I think this was published. So that's 20 years ago. And then you've got the second edition now of The Bats of Southern and Central Africa that you've co-authored with three colleagues there. And then you've got stuff over here on the right-hand side, which is to do with the other mammals, rodents, small terrestrial mammals and stuff. Talk about this very first book here. That must have been quite a big event for you, being asked to do this, putting this together. There probably wasn't anything quite like it before that. Is that right? Let's talk about that.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, I wasn't even asked to do it. It sort of was a follow-up to the smaller mammals of KwaZulu-Natal. But then I think just because we saw the public interest was escalating in the middle 90s so much, we realized there was now a need for something for the general public, and there wasn't anything before at all, as you said. So yeah, we didn't have much funding. I know we got a little bit of money from a couple of different sources, the Endangered Wildlife Trust. I remember we had to go to it was an auction, basically, at a nature reserve. They were getting scientists to basically try and raise funds by getting the private sector to donate. So we were fortunate. I had to dress up as Batman and do stupid things. And I just remember that 2 companies that I'd never heard of said, "We want to fund your bat book." And they were just, thanks to a connection between the Endangered Wildlife Trust and this auction, where we all had scientists did stupid things, but they thought this was a worthwhile cause. So with a bit of funding from these 2 companies, we managed to get an artist to do this work, and to do the artwork for this, that made such a difference. Well, the cover you see is one of Merlin Tuttle's photographs. So he also was a great supporter and allowed us, he took quite a few photographs when he visited South Africa at the time, and he said you can use any of his photography, not going to cost anything. So he was really a patron of this book as well. So that, and the artist, you can't see the pictures inside, but they were illustrated by Christine Grant, who's absolutely a superb artist. So the small amount of money we got from raising these funds went into the artwork. And I think they also made the book quite popular, because for the first time, bats were, they sort of came to life. The diversity of bats, the different colors and shapes and size of the tail, and you realize the public could get involved, and bat detectors were just becoming available. So it's really supported this. There were 2 bat groups going in South Africa at the moment, and their membership really supported this book. So it was, it gave me massive satisfaction to write that book. And
a lot of hard work, though, a lot of hard work putting something like that together. And this book here, which is come along much later, The Bats of Southern and Central Africa, which is now in its 2nd edition, which you've written with the other co-authors. I think these are people that are more experienced in different parts of Southern Africa. Is that fair? Ara is a little bit further north than yourself. Is that
Swaziland?
Correct? Yeah. A different experience, I would imagine, writing something like this as a group of people, as opposed to you driving the bus as the lead author with the first book. Do you feel the 2 books complement each other quite nicely now, or do you feel that this later book has more or less now taken over from your original book? What's your thoughts there?
Thanks for that. The original book that was published by the University of KwaZulu-Natal, unfortunately, we didn't sort of foresee the demand for it, so it went out of print, and it's never been reprinted. So there's no prints. So the second, what you're seeing there is the 2020 edition, but the 2010 edition of that Bats of Southern and Central Africa was a far more comprehensive scientific analysis, if you like. So we pooled a lot of information with scientific experts. We tried to still make it accessible to the general public, but that first book I wrote it wasn't fully referenced, and we didn't have that much information. So the second, the next book, The Bats of Southern Africa, which was the first edition in 2010 and the second edition in 2020, have met a demand for generally, and not just Southern Africa, but Southern and Central Africa. So there was a need to broaden the scope. And actually, we wished we'd just gone for the bats of Sub-Saharan Africa, because, there's still a need to fill in West Africa, East Africa, and there are books and publications that are doing that. But it really filled a need for scientific gap, and it was fully referenced, and a lot of new information became available between 2020 and now 2020. In the last 2 decades, an enormous amount of new research has become available. So that's what that book is doing. So 2020 edition was up to date a year ago, but it's a new paper came out just after that book was printed, where a lot of the little brown jobs, we call them, the small best battillionid bats, have changed their names. The genus names have all changed. And I'm sorry to do that, but my colleague Aramonajam, he proved that these names had to change, but they're not reflected in the 2020 edition even. So, and like I say, we've got a couple of new bat species that we're going to describe in the next year or two. So it's going to have to be produced again.
A third edition's going to have to happen. Is that what you're suggesting?
Somebody else maybe can put it all together. 2030.
But it's just amazing to see. I mean, and of course, all of this is supported by years and years and years of research and working in the field and communicating with surveyors and interacting with the animals and communities. And it's too easy for someone just to pick up a book and just flick through the pages and and I don't know, I'd say, oh, that looks all right. They kind of go, what? You know, it's like decades of work. Yeah, amazing stuff.
No, it's enormous. But fortunately, a lot of other projects, are providing information available more and more on a regular basis. So the African Chiroptera report comes out every year or two. It comes to thousands and thousands of pages, and it's completely free and available to the public. So it's just a really updated list of African bats, and new research, new information. It's just wonderful. So, we do have, like you say, technology has changed things a lot, but I think a lot of people still like to have a book they can pick up and open the pages.
And take with them, I suppose, into the field, in case they need to, I don't know, check a picture or check a measurement or whatever, I would imagine. So where, I suppose it's a cruel question, but your original interest was mammals that were firmly set on land, so to speak, and obviously you then got very, very heavily involved in bat-related work. Is your heart still with what you were originally, passionate about, or is it a lot more diluted now? I mean, I don't know. Is that a fair question? Is that like asking to choose between your children or something? I don't know about it.
No, that's a good question. Yeah, I still love the rodents and the shrews. So I'm still doing quite a bit of work on the rodents, particularly a group of them that look like your voles. They're shaggy things with short tails. We call them flay rats, and they're one of my favorite rodents. And they're another group that they reflect what's happening in the mountains. So the evolution has occurred across the mountains in these rodents, but many of them are becoming threatened because some of them are found only on particular mountain tops. And with fires and global change and land use change, some of these rodents are actually becoming quite rare, and there's even a couple of them become extinct, for example, in Ethiopia. So I think they are ecological indicators of great importance, rodents, of conservation and of smaller mammals. And I've also a long time been interested in the sort of ecologically based rodent management. So for rodents, we often, just like sometimes with bats, we have negative perceptions. When we think of rodents, we're thinking of, big pests and rats and house mice and things like that, although they're just a tiny proportion of the diversity of rodents. But there's a big move now towards ecologically based rodent management. So using nature, again, in the same way as bats provide such valuable, they're such important models of nature in controlling insect pests in agriculture. So we've got carnivores and birds of prey, and we've got so many natural rodent predators that we're trying to show that, rather than, again, using pesticides to control rats and rodents in agricultural areas, it's much more sustainable to look at ecologically sustainable methods, ecologically based methods of rodent control. So that's also still one of my actual pet passions is trying to show farmers again that chemical pesticides are not the answer, rodenticides are not the answer. Very often people get killed by these first generation hazardous chemicals that are still stored in people's houses and in shops and villages, and they're deadly to people, never mind wildlife. So we really have so much to learn. I'm sorry to harp on about rodents, but we have a lot to learn about ecologically based methods and more sustainable ways of controlling pests, whether they're insect pests or rodent pests.
That's fascinating. I'm so glad that I'm so glad I asked you that question, because that's just brought out a whole dynamic there that maybe wouldn't have been touched upon. So no, thank you for that. Look, we're beginning to get towards the end now, and as a thank you to Peter, we are going to make a charitable donation. And we asked Peter earlier where he would like our charitable donation on his behalf to go to. And this is the organization that he mentioned, which he has mentioned, I think, at least a couple of times earlier today in the interview. So this is the organization that you were involved in founding back in, what was it, the
1994.
1994, and it's still there today, which must give you huge pride to think. I mean, back in 1994, you were probably just struggling to get through your first year and wondering if it was even going to take off. And here we are almost, what, 30 years later, and it's still there doing good stuff. So we're delighted to offer, albeit in a small way, we're delighted to be giving these guys some of our money and hopefully for them to do something useful with. So thanks for that, Peter. Is there anything that you want to say very briefly about them before we close things off?
Yeah, it is enormously satisfying, as you say, to seeing that group grow, and I'm very grateful for that gesture. Very grateful. Yeah, they're still doing excellent work. I started the group with my colleague Eleanor Kate Richardson, and she's still going. The group is still going strong and doing really faithful, loyal, long-term work, much like the Bat Conservation Trust. Behind the scenes, hard work that goes, it's ongoing, and especially in bat rehabilitation, I think they've set new standards and how to deal with bats and how to do research on the rehabilitation of bats. It's another whole subject. So most of them are involved as bat moms or bat dads, and they do an enormously good job in rehabilitating bats and basically making the public much more aware of them.
Amazing. So check out the website, folks. And if you're watching this on BatAbility Club, underneath the recording, we'll put a link to this website so you can go and investigate it for yourself if you want to find out more about what they're doing here. So that's kind of taking us towards the end, Peter. I'll ask you to close off in a moment and just say goodbye to our audience. But before you do, I just want to say that, wow, I'd never met you before today. I'd heard all about you. I'd done a bit of research on you, obviously. And yeah, I've learned stuff today, and it's been really, really fascinating hearing about your life, your experiences, your research, the stuff that you think is important. And it's just been fascinating. And I just want to say thank you, a massive thank you to you, Peter, for your time today. And if you just want to say a few words to close off and say goodbye to our audience, that'll be us. Yeah.
Thank you, Neil. Are you asking me for a few last thoughts?
Yeah, you just say a few last thoughts and then just say goodbye to our audience, and then we'll stop the recording there.
No, I'm very grateful for this opportunity. Thank you. And I know I'm probably preaching to the converted with bat friends around the world, but I've just found it's very magical working on bats, and it's something that everybody of you who are probably listening can understand and share. This, those of us that work on bats and the conservation of bats have, we're a bit eccentric and strange, but I think, it's quite magical. So yeah, thank you for listening to all the listeners. It's been a great experience, and please continue supporting this great initiative.